The disappearance of Madeleine McCann in May 2007 from a holiday apartment in Portugal remains one of the most high-profile and perplexing unsolved cases of the 21st century. Despite extensive police investigations yielding a vast collection of files, definitive answers have remained elusive, and various suspects have been considered over the years without a resolution. In the absence of conclusive evidence, public and media attention has frequently shifted towards the behavioral analysis of Madeleine's parents, Jerry and Kate McCann. This analysis has been notably shaped by the commentary of Darren Stanton, a media figure often referred to as the human lie detector. Stanton's professional background is rooted in law enforcement, having served as a frontline police officer in Nottingham and Derby. It was during his career handling criminal investigations and domestic disputes that he cultivated an expertise in interpreting nonverbal communication and detecting deception. Transitioning from active police duty, Stanton established a prominent media career as a commentator on body language. He has been frequently called upon to analyze the behavior of public figures, from evaluating the composure of Rupert Murdoch during the phone hacking scandal to interpreting the rhetoric of politicians like Donald Trump and the non-verbal cues of members of the royal family. His role is not to determine legal guilt or innocence, but to highlight perceived inconsistencies between verbal statements and physical expressions, thereby offering the public a lens through which to glimpse what he suggests may be a hidden reality. At the core of Stanton's methodology is the concept of incongruence. This psychological principle refers to a mismatch between a person's spoken words and their nonverbal signals. Stanton posits that while verbal accounts can be carefully rehearsed and controlled by the conscious mind, the body often reveals involuntary signals, micro-expressions, subtle gestures, or grammatical slips that may betray a person's true feelings or knowledge. He argues that an observer's intuitive sense of unease when listening to someone is often a subconscious recognition of this incongruence. When the harmony between speech and gesture is broken, suspicion can arise. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. In his analysis of numerous interviews with Jerry and Kate McCann, Stanton has repeatedly identified what he describes as patterns of incongruence. He has pointed to instances of nervous gestures accompanying ostensibly calm statements, the use of the past tense when discussing a child they maintained hope of finding alive, and facial expressions that seemed at odds with the profound grief expected of them. One specific example he highlights is observing Jerry McCann delivering a verbal denial while exhibiting a subtle, almost imperceptible, affirmative head nod. Stanton refers to such moments as leakage, subconscious information escaping despite conscious efforts to maintain a controlled narrative. Stanton has consistently stopped short of direct accusation, never explicitly stating that the McCanns were guilty of any wrongdoing. However, he has repeatedly used the phrase, "something's very wrong," to summarize his findings. This carefully chosen statement is both ambiguous and impactful. It avoids making a legally liable claim while simultaneously planting a significant seed of doubt, suggesting that the public narrative presented by the parents may not align with an untold truth. This phrase became a powerful soundbite that resonated with a segment of the public already harboring suspicions. The impact of Stanton's analysis on public opinion is a subject of considerable debate. For those who already distrusted the McCanns, his observations served as an expert validation of their views. Conversely, supporters of the family have accused Stanton of fueling conspiracy theories and unethically exploiting a personal tragedy for media attention. This raises a critical question. What is the appropriate role and responsibility of a behavioral analyst when commenting on individuals who are not public figures by choice, but parents thrust into the global spotlight by a catastrophic event? The controversy surrounding Stanton's work also highlights the broader academic debate about the scientific validity of body language analysis. Supporters, citing his 2 decades of experience, argue that nonverbal cues, when read in the correct context, can be a powerful indicator of deception. Skeptics, however, contend that interpreting body language is a subjective art rather than a hard science, vulnerable to misinterpretation. A nervous gesture, they argue, could signify guilt, but it could equally reflect the immense stress of being under intense public scrutiny during a personal crisis. Stanton himself acknowledges the limitations of his field, noting that body language analysis is not admissible as evidence in a court of law and cannot be used to secure a conviction. Ultimately, the application of behavioral analysis to the McCann case demonstrates the public's profound desire for certainty in a mystery that official investigations have failed to solve. Darren Stanton's commentary, positioned at the intersection of law enforcement, psychology, and media, provides a compelling, if contentious, framework for interpretation. His work forces an important question upon the public and media alike. To what degree can we, and should we, rely on the analysis of nonverbal signals to judge credibility in the absence of factual evidence? In his detailed analysis of the interviews given by Jerry and Kate McCann, behavioral analyst Darren Stanton asserts that the patterns of incongruence he observed went beyond mere anxiety or the natural stress of a media appearance, identifying specific recurring examples which, he argues, suggest a fundamental disconnect between the spoken narrative and the internal emotional state. One of the most striking examples he highlights is found in linguistic analysis, specifically Kate McCann's occasional use of the past tense when referring to her daughter. Phrases such as "Madeleine were used in contexts where the maintained hope of finding her alive would typically elicit the present tense, "Madeleine is." While this could be dismissed as a simple grammatical error or a slip of the tongue under duress, Stanton connects it to the concept of linguistic leakage, a principle in forensic linguistics where a speaker's word choice, tense, or phrasing may unintentionally betray their true, subconscious perception of events. From this perspective, referring to a missing person in the past tense can signal an unconscious acceptance of their death, even while the conscious narrative claims otherwise. Alongside linguistic cues, Stanton places significant emphasis on pacifying gestures. These are the universal, subtle, self-soothing behaviors individuals perform to calm themselves in moments of high anxiety or inner conflict. Examples include touching one's face, rubbing the forehead, covering the mouth, or folding one's arms across the chest to create a protective barrier. Stanton observed these gestures frequently in both Jerry and Kate McCann. Jerry McCann would often touch his face or rub his nose, while Kate McCann frequently placed a hand near her mouth. Crucially, Stanton notes that the timing and context of these gestures are paramount. He reports that their frequency and intensity were most pronounced not when the couple were expressing general grief, but specifically when they were questioned on the timeline and details of the night Madeleine vanished. While pacifying gestures are a normal human response to stress for both innocent and guilty individuals, Stanton argues that a significant increase in their use when addressing specific, critical questions can indicate a heightened level of internal conflict, as if the body's pressure cooker is releasing steam. Stanton is consistently clear that behavioral indicators are not definitive proof of guilt. He likens the detection of significant incongruence to the alert from a cadaver dog. It is not evidence in itself, but a powerful signal that warrants deeper investigation. He describes these moments as yellow flags, warnings that the narrative being presented may not align with the reality of the situation. In his professional opinion, the McCann's interviews raised more of these yellow flags than almost any other case he had analyzed. To illustrate the potential power and peril of this type of analysis, he often refers to comparative cases. For instance, he cites the case of Chris Watts, the American man who murdered his family. In initial televised appeals for their safe return, Watts's words conveyed desperation, yet his body language, relaxed confidence, smiling, was profoundly incongruent, foreshadowing his subsequent confession. Conversely, Stanton also highlights cautionary tales, such as an instance where a mother's defensive body language led to suspicion, only for it to be revealed as a lifelong nervous habit, unrelated to guilt. These examples underscore the central dilemma. How can an observer reliably differentiate between the behavioral markers of extreme trauma and those of deception, while acknowledging that the relentless media scrutiny and stress could explain isolated nervous tics? Stanton maintains that trauma does not typically produce such systematic, patterned contradictions between words and gestures. This raises a key analytical question. At what point does a pattern of incongruous behavior transcend an expected stress response and become a statistically significant indicator of concealed information? Stanton's methodical analysis, which avoids direct accusation while meticulously detailing each perceived discrepancy, had a profound effect on public perception. By highlighting the head nods that contradicted verbal denials and the slips into the past tense, he provided a vocabulary and a framework that allowed segments of the public to articulate their own pre-existing unease. This contributed to a form of proxy trial, conducted not in a courtroom but in online forums and public discourse, where body language was weighed as compelling evidence. In this context, the analysis of incongruence in the McCann case becomes a mirror. It does not provide a clear image of guilt, nor does it offer absolution. Instead, it reveals what Stanton insists are undeniable cracks, a persistent tension between the story being told and the story the body appears to be feeling. To dismiss these signals, he argues, would be to ignore crucial data points. Whether these yellow flags are indicators of deception, suppressed trauma, or a more complex psychological state remains a matter of interpretation, but their existence itself demands scrutiny. The compass of behavioral analysis, as used by Stanton, points consistently towards these signs, leaving the final interpretation to others, but with the ringing caution that when words and bodies refuse to align, a vital truth may lie hidden beneath the surface. Beyond sustained, pacifying gestures, the analysis of human deception places significant weight on micro-expressions. Pioneered by the psychologist Dr. Paul Ekman, this field of study focuses on involuntary facial movements that reveal a subject's raw emotion before the conscious mind can suppress it. These flashes of fear, sadness, or anger can last for as little as a fraction of a second and are often missed by the untrained observer. However, a trained analyst like Darren Stanton will scrutinize interview footage on a frame-by-frame basis to identify these fleeting but potentially significant emotional leaks. In the McCann case, Stanton identified moments where he believed such expressions betrayed a deeper internal state than their words conveyed. He highlights one instance where Kate McCann, while describing her daughter, momentarily used the past tense. Madeleine was, and in that instant, her face showed a micro-expression of sadness, a downturn of the lips and narrowing of the eyes consistent with grief. Stanton interprets this not merely as a grammatical slip, but as a window into a subconscious conflict. While the conscious narrative was one of hope for a living child, this fleeting expression, he posits, suggested an unspoken acceptance of loss. It is crucial to note that Stanton clarifies such expressions are not confessions. Rather, he frames them as evidence of a psychological fracture, where the conscious and unconscious minds are in opposition. Stanton's analysis further contrasts these observations with behavioral models typically associated with parental grief in similar tragic circumstances. He posits that in many cases of unambiguous parental devastation, emotion is raw and congruent, meaning the body's signals align with the spoken words. By contrast, he interpreted the McCann's reliance on pacifying behaviors, such as folded arms and frequent self-touching, not as signs of unfiltered sorrow, but as indicators of careful self-regulation and the containment of information. This interpretation leads to a central analytical question. Why might individuals at the center of such a tragedy engage in behavior more aligned with managing appearances than with expressing raw grief? While Stanton does not provide a definitive answer, the question itself encourages a deeper scrutiny of the couple's public demeanor. This analysis had a profound impact, transforming for many viewers what seemed like controlled interviews into performances where nonverbal cues appeared to carry more weight than the words themselves, fueling public debate over whether the behaviors were signs of exhaustion and trauma or something else. The analysis of verbal communication is considered by Stanton to be as revealing as body language, particularly through the concept of distancing language. This refers to the specific words, phrases, and grammatical structures a person might use to psychologically insulate themselves from a traumatic or difficult topic. He drew sharp attention to an interview where Kate McCann stated, "I want to tell my version." To an analyst of forensic linguistics, the word version can be a significant flag. It implies subjectivity and acknowledges the existence of other possible accounts, whereas an individual recounting a singular objective truth might more commonly refer to what happened or my story. Stanton interprets this phrasing as a way of presenting a crafted narrative rather than a raw, factual recollection, thereby creating distance from the event itself. This linguistic analysis was extended to the focus of the McCann's public statements. Stanton noted that while the search for their daughter was the stated purpose of their interviews, the grammatical center of gravity often shifted from Madeleine, she, to the parents, we. Sentences frequently centered on their own suffering, the slander they had faced, and their unfair portrayal in the media. While these statements were factually true, Stanton argues that the speech patterns of parents consumed by the singular focus of finding a missing child typically remain fixated on the child. The frequent shift back to their own ordeal was, in his reading, psychologically significant and more aligned with the rhetoric of individuals building a defense in the court of public opinion. He further argued that Kate McCann's book, Madeleine, while presented as a mother's plea, was structured more like a legal defense, with entire chapters dedicated to refuting accusations and detailing the burden of suspicion. In Stanton's view, this pattern of communication suggested the McCanns were not just grieving parents, but also individuals highly conscious of and actively participating in the public trial of their reputation. In his analysis of the McCann's public communications, Darren Stanton posits that their interviews often functioned as exercises in reputation management rather than as raw expressions of anguish. He identifies a pattern of defensive communication, particularly in the frequent linguistic shift from focusing on their daughter, she, to focusing on their own experience, we. Phrases centering on how we have been wronged or we have been treated unfairly were, in his view, psychologically significant. Once this linguistic pattern was highlighted by analysts, it became a major point of focus in the public's re-examination of interview footage, with some viewers seizing upon it as evidence that the parents were more concerned with their own image than their child. While defenders argued that any individual under such extraordinary public pressure would naturally speak of their own suffering, Stanton's framing suggested that this self-referential language could be a retreat used by those who feel cornered or vulnerable. Within his framework, the dual track of communication, grief interwoven with defense, clashed with the public's expectation of parents consumed by a singular tragedy, creating a perception that the McCanns were staging a narrative rather than living one. The analysis suggests that concealment does not always manifest in outright lies, but can hide in the subtle framing and emphasis of language. To contextualize his findings, Stanton's analysis frequently draws on comparisons with other high-profile cases, which serve to illustrate both the potential power and the inherent risks of interpreting nonverbal cues. Two cases are particularly critical to his framework: the confession of the American murderer Chris Watts and a misjudged case of a double murder in India. The story of Chris Watts is presented as a chillingly clear example of incongruence correctly signaling guilt. In 2018, Watts appeared on television pleading for the safe return of his wife and daughters, yet his non-verbal behavior was glaringly inconsistent with his words. He smiled faintly while professing grief and adopted a relaxed posture, communicating a polished composure rather than anguish. Days later, he confessed to their murders. For Stanton, the Watts case became a textbook example of the body leaking a terrible truth, validating the principle that a significant divergence between a verbal narrative and nonverbal signals is a profound indicator that something is wrong. However, Stanton balances this with a crucial cautionary tale to emphasize the absolute necessity of context. He often cites a double murder case in India where suspicion fell upon the deceased girl's parents, particularly the mother. Her stiff, defensive, and unexpressive demeanor in television interviews was interpreted by some media analysts at the time as a hallmark of concealment and guilt. Yet it was later understood that her so-called red flags, crossed arms, lack of eye contact, were ingrained, lifelong personal habits and culturally specific behaviors, not indicators of deception. This case serves as a stark reminder that while the body may be an honest communicator, its signals can be profoundly misunderstood without a proper baseline and cultural understanding. Placing these two examples side by side illustrates the balanced approach Stanton strives for in his analysis of the McCanns. The Chris Watts case validates the method of scrutinizing for incongruence, while the case from India demands humility and demonstrates how easily such signals can be misread. From this, Stanton derives his core principle. The significance lies not in any single sign, but in the accumulation of signs. An isolated pacifying gesture or a single slip of the tongue could easily be a mistake or a simple response to stress. However, when these indicators appear repeatedly and consistently, particularly in response to direct questions about the night of Madeleine's disappearance, he argues that the pattern becomes statistically abnormal and therefore significant. While always stopping short of declaring this proves involvement, Stanton concluded that the McCanns exhibited an unusually high frequency of incongruence, a deviation from the norm that, in his professional view, was itself a compelling reason for further scrutiny. In his concluding analysis, Darren Stanton situates the McCann case within a comparative framework, positioning their behavior in a challenging middle ground between the clear deception of Chris Watts and the misinterpreted innocence of the Indian mother. He argues that while the context of trauma and media pressure must be considered, he struggled to find contextual explanations that could account for the sheer volume and persistent pattern of incongruence displayed by the couple. The lesson, he reminded viewers, was not to convict on body language, but to listen carefully to what the body may reveal. For Stanton, the core issue was the overwhelming measure of subconscious leakage, which he believed could not be responsibly dismissed. It was this accumulation of signs that led him to repeat his disquieting refrain: "Something is undeniably very wrong." When these observations reached the public, they entered a discourse already highly polarized by years of debate, emotion, and suspicion. Though Stanton never made a direct accusation, his analysis was seized upon by the public as if it were a verdict, creating an immediate and profoundly divided reaction. For those who had long held suspicions about Jerry and Kate McCann, Stanton's analysis provided a powerful sense of validation. This group felt that a professional had finally articulated the unease they had harbored for years, translating their intuitive feelings into a technical vocabulary of pacifying gestures, linguistic leakage, and incongruence. Online forums filled with comments praising him as a truth-teller who dared to voice what official channels would not. A striking irony emerged within this group's response. They lauded Stanton for his professional neutrality, while paradoxically interpreting that same careful neutrality as a definitive confirmation of the parents' guilt. By refusing to make a direct accusation, Stanton left a void of interpretation which those with pre-existing suspicions filled with certainty. On the other side of the debate stood those who had consistently defended the McCanns. For them, Stanton's analysis was not validation, but a form of cruelty. They viewed it as the unfair dissection of a grieving couple's every gesture and word choice, already under the relentless microscope of public scrutiny. Critics accused Stanton of fueling conspiracy theories and giving a pseudo-scientific gloss to unfounded suspicion, arguing that body language is a subjective art, not a hard science. They contended that grief manifests in countless ways and that the immense stress of their situation could easily explain any perceived behavioral anomalies. To this group, Stanton was not a beacon of truth, but another contributor to a chorus of unfair judgment. This deep public divide was significantly amplified by the media, particularly by tabloids which often exaggerated his nuanced statements into sensational, accusatory headlines. His carefully worded observations were frequently distorted into insinuations, feeding both sides of the debate with fresh ammunition. Even the mainstream press struggled, with some outlets treating him as a credible expert, while others criticized the coverage as irresponsible. Ultimately, the media ensured Stanton's analysis became woven into the very mythology of the McCann case. As a result, Stanton himself became a contested figure, simultaneously praised for his courage and condemned for what some saw as opportunism. The entire episode serves as a compelling case study in the intersection of expert commentary, media sensationalism, and public opinion, forcing a critical examination of the ethical responsibilities of analysts in high-profile cases and the way their professional observations are processed and often distorted within a deeply polarized public sphere. Darren Stanton's attempt to maintain a neutral professional stance, consistently emphasizing that his analysis was a signal not proof, proved untenable within the highly polarized climate of the McCann case. His nuanced position was largely lost as both supporters and critics of the McCanns either co-opted his findings to support their views or attacked his methods to discredit them. The resulting controversy broadened into a wider public discourse, becoming a proxy debate on a more fundamental question. How does a society establish truth when conclusive evidence is absent? Stanton's work forced conversations about the legitimacy of behavioral science itself into the mainstream, questioning whether the interpretation of nonverbal cues is a valid analytical tool or a subjective art form. His analysis became raw material for online citizen investigations, where forums dedicated to the case dissected his every word and applied his methodology to interview footage, often straying into realms of certainty that he himself never endorsed. This phenomenon raised profound ethical questions about the pursuit of justice, leaving many to wonder whether his contribution ultimately illuminated the case or deepened its shadows. What is undeniable is that Stanton's observations intensified the emotional polarization surrounding the parents. He did not solve the mystery, but he amplified its social resonance, turning subtle gestures and fleeting expressions into points of global contention and becoming a participant in, rather than just an observer of, the case's legacy. The ultimate irony is that in his attempt to interpret the subconscious signals of the McCanns, Stanton's work inadvertently revealed more about the psychology of the public. It demonstrated that when faced with an enduring and painful mystery, society often does not seek neutrality, but gravitates towards affirming pre-existing beliefs, seeking certainty even where none is possible. While Stanton never endorsed specific criminal theories, his observations on incongruence became the seeds from which the public cultivated several dominant narratives. The first and most pervasive of these was the theory of a cover-up. Many interpreted his key phrase, "something's very wrong," as a diplomatic assertion that the parents knew more than they were admitting, with their polished media appearances and use of distancing language seen as evidence of deliberate concealment. Closely linked to this was the theory of an accidental death, which posited that Madeleine had died through a misadventure in the apartment, and that her parents had panicked and hidden the truth. Stanton's analysis of linguistic leakage, particularly Kate McCann's slips into the past tense and the micro-expressions of sadness that accompanied them, was taken by proponents of this theory as a subconscious acceptance of a finality that was not being admitted publicly. A third, more subtle theory was that of an embedded confession, a concept from forensic linguistics where individuals unintentionally reveal truths through their specific choice of words. Kate McCann's statement, "I want to tell my version," was seized upon as a prime example, suggesting a crafted account rather than a singular, objective reality. In the end, Stanton's analysis, intended as a guide to understanding human behavior, became a mirror reflecting a society grappling with uncertainty, demonstrating how, in the absence of facts, even the smallest gesture can be imbued with profound and divisive meaning. While Darren Stanton never explicitly endorsed theories of a cover-up or accidental death, his analysis provided a framework that enabled widespread public interpretation. By identifying incongruities and highlighting linguistic patterns, he created fertile ground upon which viewers could project their own conclusions. His professional neutrality, intended to preserve objectivity, instead allowed his observations to become a toolkit for those already harboring suspicions. Online forums were filled with annotated transcripts and slowed-down video clips, as viewers used his concepts of leakage and distancing to build what they believed was a case against the parents. Defenders of the McCanns argued this was a profound misapplication of behavioral science, a distortion of ambiguous grief into evidence. However, these public-derived theories persisted precisely because they offered a coherent narrative in the spaces left empty by the official investigation. This created a significant paradox. Stanton consistently cautioned against such leaps of logic, yet his very refusal to offer a definitive conclusion seemed to intensify speculation, as some interpreted his professional restraint as a sign that he knew a truth too sensitive to state outright. Ultimately, his analysis, though intended as neutral, became supporting material for theories that, while unable to stand in a court of law, thrived in the arena of public opinion. The episode reveals as much about the audience as it does about the subjects of the analysis. In the absence of hard proof, people often cling to signs and signals to make sense of the incomprehensible. Stanton provided a language for these doubts, and with those tools, the public constructed narratives that continue to shape the conversation surrounding the case to this day. This leads to the central and most potent irony of his involvement, which lies in the public reception of his professional mantra. Throughout his career, Stanton has maintained the line, "I do not accuse anyone, I only analyze behavior." It is a shield for his credibility and a reflection of his background in law enforcement, where the boundary between evidence and accusation is paramount. However, in the McCann case, the impact of his language was determined not by his intent, but by how it was heard. His famous refrain, "Something's very wrong," though designed to stop short of an accusation, carried the force of a verdict for much of the public. For many listeners, the statement, "I don't accuse, but something's very wrong," was functionally indistinguishable from declaring a belief that information was being concealed. This phrase became a rallying cry for skeptics, who interpreted his caution not as professional restraint, but as a form of coded confirmation. In the court of public opinion, he was transformed from an analyst into a de facto accuser, albeit one who chose his words with surgical care. The entire affair serves as a compelling case study on the relationship between expert commentary, media interpretation, and public perception. It demonstrates how, in a vacuum of certainty, an analyst's cautious observation can be transformed into a powerful social fact, shaping a global narrative in ways the originator neither intended nor controlled, leaving a lasting and contested legacy. For supporters of the McCanns, Darren Stanton's analysis was perceived as an accusation in everything but name. By suggesting a profound abnormality in their behavior, he planted a stigma that, in their view, was both reckless and unfair. This critique highlights the central paradox of Stanton's professional approach. On one hand, by meticulously stopping short of a direct accusation, he protected his professional integrity and operated within the accepted boundaries of his field. This adherence to analyzing signals rather than pronouncing guilt gave him the credibility to be a trusted media commentator, safe from legal risk. On the other hand, the very ambiguity that safeguarded him professionally also created an interpretive vacuum. This space was immediately filled by the public's own convictions and biases, turning Stanton into a kind of Rorschach test for the case. People saw in his analysis a reflection of what they already believed, meaning the neutrality he claimed was rarely experienced as neutral. This dynamic illustrates the immense power of his restrained methodology. Had Stanton been overtly sensationalist, he might have been easily dismissed. However, because his tone was consistently careful and he insisted on his role as a neutral observer, his subtle warning that something's very wrong carried far greater weight. The perception among many viewers was that if an analyst this cautious was raising an alarm, the signal must be significant. This credibility, however, had an unavoidable downside. Despite his intentions, his framework became a tool for those seeking to condemn the McCanns without forensic evidence, with his phrases often decontextualized for use in headlines and online debates. This demonstrates the wide gulf that can exist between an analyst's professional intent and the public's reception of their work. Ultimately, the question of whether Stanton acted as a neutral analyst or a subtle accuser may be unresolvable, as it hinges on the distinction between professional conduct and public perception. While he is legally and technically correct in his assertion of neutrality, in the public sphere, perception is often more powerful than intent. For skeptics, he is the expert who validated their doubts. For supporters, he is the commentator who unfairly maligned grieving parents. His greatest professional strength, his careful restraint, is the very quality that made his implicit warning so potent and, to his critics, so damaging. Perhaps this is the unavoidable challenge for any expert who analyzes deception. The moment one points to an incongruity in a high-profile case, one steps into a complex ethical territory where objective observation can become indistinguishable from subjective accusation in the eyes of a world desperate for answers. The legacy of Darren Stanton's involvement in the Madeleine McCann case is one of profound ambiguity, occupying a twilight zone between accusation and absolution, where every interpreted signal carries more weight than perhaps intended. The enduring lesson from his analysis is that while words may be rehearsed and narratives crafted, the human body resists deception and finds ways to leak its truth. For the public, the practical takeaway is an encouragement to develop a greater literacy in non-verbal communication, to notice the subtle incongruities in daily interactions that may serve as early warnings or prompt a more cautious approach. For the media, the lesson is one of immense responsibility. Stanton's analysis demonstrates how fragile the line is between observation and accusation, and how a carefully chosen phrase can be magnified by headlines, risking profound injustice when an analytical tool is treated as a verdict. In the pursuit of ratings, the crucial reminder that behavioral analysis is circumstantial, not evidential, is often lost, leading to distortions that can permanently scar lives. For Jerry and Kate McCann themselves, the consequences of this public analysis are deep and lasting. The footage of their interviews and the associated cloud of suspicion has become as enduring in the public imagination as the facts of the case itself, ensuring that the question of what is being left unsaid lingers, prompted not by evidence, but by the stubborn honesty of human behavior. Stanton's work, therefore, leaves us at an uneasy crossroads. He teaches that incongruence signals a conflict between an inner truth and an outer performance, but simultaneously warns that these signals must be read with caution and never be mistaken for proof. His role was not to solve the mystery, but to ensure the public did not ignore the whispers beneath the words. Ultimately, what he contributed was not a solution, but a lens, a way of seeing that unsettled, provoked, and forced a deeper reconsideration of the case. His analysis is a powerful reminder that behind every polished statement lies a human body with its own language, and that language is often harder to disguise than words. While the world continues to ask what happened to Madeleine McCann, it is the sense that truth leaves traces, in a gesture, a nod, or a slip of the tongue, that keeps the mystery alive in our collective consciousness. This restless honesty of the body ensures that complex cases like this never truly fade, preventing the easy acceptance of official narratives and compelling us to keep asking questions. The truth may remain hidden, but the body's whispers echo on, a reminder that something vital in this story has yet to be told. As our examination of this case concludes, leaving you in the quiet space where words end and whispers begin, we are left to ask, how does this journey into the unspoken leave you feeling? Do you find yourself with a strengthened conviction, a more profound doubt, or an unsettling awareness of the fragile nature of truth itself? When you next encounter a story that defies a simple explanation, will you listen more intently for the signals hidden beneath the surface, or will you consciously step back, wary of the fine line between critical analysis and speculative judgment? In our shared, desperate search for resolution in the face of such an enduring mystery, what do you believe is our ultimate responsibility? To pursue every potential sign of a hidden truth, no matter how faint, or to shield the human beings at the center of the storm from the devastating weight of our collective suspicion? Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.